cutting down on meat is good for biodiversity. It's because of, if you look at the biodiversity crisis, there's 5 main drivers behind it. And the biggest one is habitat change, or the destruction of natural habitat ecosystems. The other ones are invasive species, climate change, and pollution. And the last one is overexploitation of species, fishing, hunting, all that. But the main one is habitat change. If you took all the areas we use on land to produce fodder and have grassland and all that, only to produce meat and dairy, we have an area that's the same as North America and Brazil combined. So if you took all that land and you said, we're not going to make all this animal feed, we're going to make vegetables instead, you would loosen up a lot of land. We're talking millions of square kilometers.
Hello and welcome to the show, Alex.
Thank you.
I've really been looking forward to having you here. You have a podcast yourself called The Animalistic Hour, or Den Dyriske Time, that I really enjoy listening to. So first of all, thank you for doing that.
Of course.
Can you tell us about what's the basic concept of Den Dyriske Time? Why did you start it?
It doesn't translate so well into English, does it?
No, The Animalistic Hour?
Yeah, it sounds more like it's got a bondage vibe.
Yeah, it could be one of those shows.
We could call it just maybe The Animal Hour, but then it sounds more like it's just about animals. It's not, though. It's a bit broader. It's about the biodiversity, biology in general, climate, animal welfare. I just figured, if you look at the Danish media, we don't really have one media outlet that focuses on the biodiversity crisis. Like, if you were to go in and look up the news about biodiversity, the crisis, all that, where'd you look?
I would only know one place to go. I would go to Zetland. But I think that's also kind of still limited in scope.
Yeah. And they've only got some chapters about, they did some on deep sea mining, for example, which was super relevant. But considering how it's such a big crisis, it's the biggest mass extinction event on this planet for 65 million years, it's a bit rare that no one covers it. So I sort of had that in the back of my mind, and I figured I'm a nerd. I've been reading animal books for the last fucking 18 years. I know lots about this stuff, so why not just make a podcast? And then I did.
And did a lot of research on it, and the way I listen to the podcast is that I get some news on sort of the world of nature that I find, I should say, that it's incredibly uncovered. Mm-hmm. I mean, compared to we lost 67% of all living species with a spine in the past 50 years.
Yeah, people say
I don't know if I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty extraordinary. And when I go and I tell that to audiences, they're like, surely that can't be right. And then they start Googling and they're like, oh, fuck, it's right.
It's a bit shit.
And then I listen to your show and I get so much texture on it. So thanks a lot for that. And
of course.
The sort of the inner workings around that is that you're actually, you had a sponsor for a while, but a lot of it is actually a philanthropic or sort of altruistic project, right?
It's true. Basically just like an angel, just providing
Absolutely.
free goods. Yeah.
If we can somehow get sort of
a little halo, get a halo going. Yeah.
I would really appreciate it. But I invited you here on the show because a lot of our listeners they care about sustainability, they care about the green transition, and biodiversity is one of those topics that everyone in the healthcare industry is going to have. They're going to have an opinion on biodiversity soon. I feel the topic sort of in a commercial setting is still in its infancy. There's not a lot of good biodiversity strategies out there, and that's why I wanted to do this sort of biodiversity one-on-one. We bring Alexander fucking Holm from the Animalistic Hour in here to tell us what's up and down.
Good.
So, what is biodiversity?
It's a good question. It's a scary question too. I've been to some of my friends' master's defenses in biology, where they've been asked by the lecturers and the professors, and I saw one guy who almost started crying when they asked him, just because, biodiversity, you think it's just how many species are there? But it's not really. It's, it's the I would say, like in Danish, we used to say it's the mangfoldighed of arter, like the diversity of species and life. So you could look at the biodiversity in terms of species and the number of individuals and the genetic diversity. You could take one of each species on Earth and just put it on an ark, and you'd just have like not that much diversity really.
I heard about this guy that did it once.
Yeah, they made a movie about him. He's called Russell Crowe.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's also habitat. You know, if you only had one habitat in all the species, of course it wouldn't really work, but it's genetic diversity and it's species diversity and habitat diversity, and then just all of it fucking mixed together. So it's just like the diversity of life, really.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you're asking or when I am asking you what is biodiversity, I might as well ask what is life?
Yes.
Okay, then let's try and ask that. What is life?
Well, that's a good question too. I think there's a limit where where people discuss whether something's living, like viruses, for example. They cannot proliferate without a host, and they're not living in on their own. They need something in order to, come in and use other organisms to just breed. And then people are like, are they living or dead? And some species, they move where they're controlled by other viruses, and you're like, are they zombies then? And it's a bit tricky, but I'd say that life is, ever since you had that first organism, you called it Luca, which means something with like the first organism in a way, this little piece of RNA that was able to replicate itself. I'd say that from that point on, you had life. But then again, I'm going to be bashed for saying that because it's being discussed so much, right? Yeah. And there's life in space probably and all that. It could look different. So yeah, it's a difficult question that I'm probably unable to answer.
Okay. So that's a good start. So if we're going to kind of try again and say, with a certain margin of error, and that sort of level of interpretation that we're going to allow for this experiment, what is biodiversity?
Well, it's the multitude of life, that thing. It's all the species, all the habitats, and all the genetic diversity.
No. So we're looking at all the way to the smallest bacteria and all the way up to the blue whale. But then we're also kind of branching out into plants and into fungi.
Yep.
Is there a group here that I'm forgetting about?
Yeah, the archaea and the viruses. If you imagine all the things you listed there, and we take them down, like imagine we have those that's the horizontal, the vertical level, then you can also say that biodiversity is also branching it out on the horizontal level, because you need genetic diversity within the species too. Otherwise, the diversity is just not there, and they're not able to proliferate and breed because you're just going to have too little genetic diversity, and they're going to die out, be inbred, all that.
So I hear this phrase going on quite often where, it could be someone who's sort of promoting vegetarianism, which I'm all for. It's very hard to be against vegetarianism, I'd argue. Sure. But then I would hear kind of some of the reasonings behind it, and as an anthropologist, it spurs my curiosity when someone says it's also good for the biodiversity.
Yeah.
And then for me it begs the question, how? Or how do we know that it's good for biodiversity? And even what is biodiversity? But something I'm often conflicted about is when we're looking at biodiversity, I suppose you could have sort of, okay, there's a blue beetle, there's a red beetle, there's a yellow beetle, there's a fly, there's a mosquito, and then just count the species, right? Yeah. And the animal species, the plant species, the microorganisms, the fungi, all of those. Yeah. So now I counted all of these different species I could find. Yeah. Okay, but how do I go about sort of figuring out what about the number of individuals in each, the genetic diversity in each of those species, and I would also say sort of how do I figure out which one of them are important?
So when you say that cutting down on meat is good for biodiversity, it's because of, if you look at the biodiversity crisis, there's 5 main drivers behind it. And the biggest one is habitat change. or the destruction of natural habitat ecosystems. The other ones are invasive species, climate change and pollution, and the last one is overexploitation of species, fishing, hunting, all that. But the main one is habitat change. And if we look at the planet now, planet Earth, we have modified around, I think it's like 77% of the habitable area, the area we could live in. And half of that, it's more than that. I think it's 77. We've taken a ton of the planet and we use it for agriculture. We talk more than 50%. And by far the majority of that we use to produce fodder, animal feed. We've taken, it's like the amounts of land we've used for it is extreme. If you took all the areas we use on land to produce fodder and have grassland and all that, only to produce meat and dairy, we have an area that's the same as North America and Brazil combined. Wow. So if you took all that land and you said, we're not going to make all this animal feed, we're going to make vegetables instead, you would loosen up a lot of land. We're talking millions of square kilometers. And in those areas, biodiversity could come in. And also, you could have some of the areas, say the soy production areas you have in Brazil, where we cut down like a lot of the rainforest in order to make soy, in order to feed the pigs in Denmark, for example. Instead of cutting down the rainforest to make soy, you just stop. And then you make plants instead, and you don't need excessive amounts of feed for the animals. Also, just like it's not an effective way to produce food, really, to produce pig meat, for example. Yeah. If you want to produce 1 kilo of meat, you need 6 or 7 kilos of fodder. And that's just like, you just make more food and more calories into less, which is not really a good idea.
I call it the animal filter. It's a very bad filter,
right,
for food production. It also shortens the shelf life, which is making it more perishable. And
then you have like, what, 10 or 12,000 people who die from hunger every day, and then simultaneously you make more food into less, which is just, and it's bad for the climate too. It's bad for biodiversity because you cut down natural areas to make all the fodder. It just doesn't really, it's not a good idea.
It's baffling. So that's basically the conclusion you come to is that if we can avoid having a large area of monoculture, we're going to get a multiculture or natural culture, or something leaning towards something we could call natural, with several species, and maybe also with a higher sort of combined tonnage of life, or whichever measurement we would use. What do you use to measure biodiversity? How do you actually measure it?
You've used, for example, when you made the biodiversity hotspots, if you've heard of that, there was an article that came out in like year 2000, made by this guy called something Myers, where he appointed 20 hotspots around the Earth, where he was like, here we have the highest biodiversity. And he looked at the plant diversity. So you just look at like the concentration of plant species within a certain area. And when you look at some, it's usually the measure that you use. It's the same, like if we look at the most biodiverse places on Earth now, you have on land, it's like the Andes, for example. Something just happened in Ecuador. I don't know what it was, but probably like a mix of, you have mountains, you have valleys, you have high humidity, you have a lot of rainfall, there's a lot of sun, there's all that, and it just comes together and it's like copulating and creating intense biodiversity. Same in the Eastern Arc Mountains, and then you have coral reefs where it's like some other stuff happening at sea. But it's usually that you look at how big is the concentration of species within a certain area. And then usually you don't look at bacteria and vira and all that, because otherwise we'd look at biodiversity and you would have completely different measures, because some places, there's a lot of bacteria and not that many big animals, etc.
So you basically kind of decide an approach, and either you count species or you count individuals, or you sort of conclude that here there's a high degree of diversity, but you don't really have a measuring stick for it. And
yeah, that's the thing. Like if there's a lot of species within a limited area, then you say biodiversity is crazy. And then, especially if some of the species are endemic, so they're only found within that area. Mm-hmm. So if you look at two extremes, you can take like the middle of Antarctica, where there's fuck all. Yeah. Like no vertebrates. You might see a bird or something.
No one want to go there.
No, there's no insects. You might find some lichen, and that's about it. Yeah. Or if you go to certain parts of Sahara or whatever, or the Kalahari or Australia, it's just barren. It's barren as fuck. There's nothing. And then you compare that to something like the heart of Borneo, or the foot of the Himalayas, or something where it's just going fucking crazy.
Ecuador.
Yeah, Ecuador.
If we don't really have sort of a firm definition of what is biodiversity, as you said, it can actually be many things.
It is many things, yeah.
We have a lot of different sort of parameters to measure on. We have the genetic diversity, we have the number of individuals of a certain species, we have the different species, and then we have, do you call it families in biology? You have plants, fungi.
That's kingdoms.
Kingdoms.
Yes.
Oh, that's a great word.
Yeah, it's the kingdoms. Yeah.
A really bright mind came up with that.
Right.
So you have the different kingdoms as well. That sounds like something that's incredibly hard to fathom in a way. So if you know, I have to go to my neighbor. Now my neighbor is a very smart person, but I'll go to someone else that I pick off random in the streets.
Take my neighbor; they're not that.
So we take one of your neighbors.
Yeah.
And I want them to sort of understand that there's a biodiversity crisis, that it's important, and that action from their side
is required.
Mm-hmm. I could sort of go with the panda approach, right? And I could ask them to help protect the panda. Mm-hmm. And that's a strategy I've heard you describe as the umbrella species. So the panda is an umbrella species. Can you please explain what is an umbrella species?
Well, an umbrella species is sort of like, if you want to protect the panda, you've got to protect the area that it lives in, the ecosystem or the habitat. Otherwise, it's sort of futile, you know. Same with the tiger, the rhino, the elephant. You take charismatic species, you also call them flagship species then, which is sort of because they can be in front of a campaign that just hauls in a ton of money. Yeah. And then you select those and you like, give some money to save the panda. And usually like, yeah, of course the panda has to be saved, that's important. But it's way more important to conserve the whole ecosystem that it lives in. And then you imagine you have the panda in the midst of it and you protect that. So it's sort of like everything that falls under the umbrella that you protect to protect the panda. It's why you call it an umbrella species.
Yeah, because they're basically kind of covering an entire area, and they're easy to understand. They're easy to use as a mascot for mobilization.
Exactly.
Maybe kind of like a politician, right? That a politician will have a huge apparatus of different people that are helping them sort of execute on the politics and influence the negotiations and sort of conduct and write the papers and everything. And in a way, you know, a politician is sort of a human societal model for an umbrella species that we understand that they become a symbol, right?
It's true. Politicians are umbrella species.
And they have an ecosystem behind them. What is the problem with the umbrella species strategy?
Some of it is that sometimes we become a little bit overly focused on certain species, and we tend to maybe forget the rest. And I mean, it's difficult to criticize too much because it's so efficient, the method. Like if, let's say we made an NGO and we wanted to get a ton of money, and we had the species that we chose to put on the front of our magazine and all that, we chose spiders, or we chose earthworms, or we chose, I don't know, moths. Yeah. It's like, good luck getting more than fucking 1,000 kroner a month, right? Yeah. So it makes sense in that way. The problem is that the focus can become a bit narrow, and some areas there's not that many umbrella species, or not that many charismatic species, which makes it a bit more tricky. Also because people just tend to, they'd rather give money to pandas and orangutans and all that than the other ones. And then you have like, it's being skewed towards charisma rather than conserving biodiversity in a way. But luckily, many of those charismatic species live in the most biodiverse areas.
I mean, the orangutan, a great example. We also had Sebastian and Slow in here and discussing various approaches to sort of doing agroforestry and converting monocultures into something that can enhance biodiversity and also create habitat for biodiversity, which I think is a great element to the strategy. If we're sort of looking at this strategy of picking an umbrella species, and the problem is that we're forgetting other species, I'm really curious to kind of understand if there's something we could call sort of a catalyst species. I've heard stories about I think it's called the feather starfish. It's like this weird kind of long feathers starfish.
Like a fucking alien,
yeah. Strange, very alien creature when you watch video of it, and it has sort of a symbiosis with other animals that take on the color patterns of the feather starfish.
And they hide in it, right?
Yeah, they hide in it, and it's shrimp, and it's scorpions, it's lobsters, it's this weird fish that developed no fins and just wiggle. It just literally wiggles
it's
around.
Like the ultimate hitchhiker.
Yeah, it's the ultimate hitchhiker. It's like evolutionary specialized hitchhiker.
Yeah.
And you know, they're doing studies about sort of how is the behavior of these animals if you remove it from the host, where will it go? And many of them will actually be sort of
go extinct.
They have very high fidelity, so they will go back to the host, even though they're being planned with the different host. But what I'm trying to get at here is are there sort of certain species that are nucleus to biodiversity where if you remove them, they will have the opposite effect of the umbrella species effect?
You could say if there's some species that is beneficial to remove, those are the invasive ones. The ones that we introduced either by accident or on purpose. Say rabbits or foxes in Australia or camels in Australia, or say rats in Denmark, for example, or in all of the world actually, the brown and the black rat. I mean, the black rat is a Chinese species we just put everywhere. So if you remove those cats and fucking dogs and all that, removing those would be way like it would be so good for biodiversity. You have many, many species that are endangered now only because rats and dogs are just fucking the ecosystem up, really. They're just running wild and eating whatever. But the species that, if you remove them, you have the ecosystem collapse or become way more fragile. You call those keystone species. And those are super important. Some good examples are, you could take the bison in the States, for example. It definitely must have had some major effects when you just came in and you killed, I don't know, what was it, 30 or 50 million bison, like a huge grazer, just stabilizing the ecosystem in various ways. You just remove that and then you make way too big part of the States into cornfields or whatever fields. That would, if you hadn't made it into fields, it would look completely different because you removed that. It's a whole ecosystem that, when I say collapse, I don't mean that it's just like going all barren and becoming desert or looking like Mordor, but it just changes in a way, and the change facilitates that many species can't live there anymore, and you don't want that. So keystone species is just way important. It's a bit like wolves, for example. In the northern hemisphere, they're super important to regulate the populations of various big grazers, for example. Now we have hunters doing it in Denmark, shooting away all the deer, but if we didn't have hunters, it wouldn't be nice. I mean, they'd just breed and they'd go crazy and you'd have so many of them just dying everywhere, right? Because nothing regulates it. So you need species to perform those key functions in the ecosystem, and those are keystone species, and you really don't want those to die out.
But I also heard a theory, I think it was the Yellowstone Park, where they reintroduced wolves and they had cascading effects. It had so many sort of positive effects. I don't know if it has later been debunked. But there was also a point that they would dictate behavior of the groups of grazers that would make them go more compact. So they would sort of move around the area in a different way, and they would protect themselves and have these sort of swarm defensive tactics that then influenced where they would contribute with nutrition from piss and shit, and I don't, manure is probably the
let's call it poop.
Yeah, all the poop.
Yeah.
And that would go into very high concentrations in certain areas where they would move, and that would just create new habitats for insects and bacteria, and then for plant species, and it would have this effect where it could actually get quite lush all of a sudden, just from having the wolves sort of trigger instinctive behavior of flock mentality for the large grazing animals, and then it would kind of change the entire landscape. How much of that is really great marketing, and how much of that is reality, sort of from the lens of biology, the way you see it?
I don't know. I heard like that stuff about the Yellowstone and reintroduction of the wolves and all that. I've heard it told as sort of like this good story, a good example of rewilding. And then I heard some stuff about it being debunked, but I haven't looked enough into it that I'm going to comment on it, because I'm pretty sure that I might be wrong. Yeah. But reintroduction of big predators usually is never a bad idea. You've seen it in, we have like the discussion about rewilding in Denmark, where you're like, oh shit, people are so mean. And
they really disagree, right? I've been trying to figure out what's up and down in the entire rewilding discussion. Yeah. And what I can conclude from the outside is that they might as well be mortal enemies. What's very hard for me to figure out is what are they for and what are they against? Yeah, and I'm reading through the discussions, and I just find myself like truly wondering, what are you actually talking about?
That's the thing.
Do you know what the conflict is about, and can you explain it?
Yeah, it's because, like, you know, in Denmark we don't have any of the big grazers left because we killed all of them. And then we want to reintroduce them to reestablish the ecosystems and get the biodiversity back, because the big grazers, they perform some vital functions, and then you're going to have biodiversity again. And so we want to fence in some areas, put out some big grazers and let them do the work. And then people are like, you're not going to feed the horses? We're like, no, it's wild animals. They feed themselves. That's how the nature works. And they're like, you're not going to feed the fucking horses? And then you have like, that's just it. Then it goes crazy. And then there was like this one episode some years back where I think it was Aarhus University that did some rewilding, and some people fucked a bit up, and some horses, they didn't get fed enough. And that was a fuck up, but that was just rewilding in a way where they didn't do it right. Whereas now when we do rewilding at Mols Bjerge, for example, they check up on the horses so much that it's probably the most upchecked horses in all of Denmark. And if a horse is malnutritioned or whatever, either they put it down or they feed them. So people have just misunderstood this whole thing, and they think that people just want, and they're talking Rasmus Ejnes, Morten Didi, all these guys, they think they just want to put out some horses and they just want to torture them. Yeah. And they think that rewilding is like this uniquely Danish phenomenon that they developed, whereas we've been doing rewilding in, I think, 70 countries for the last fucking 40 years. I mean, we have more than 1 million square kilometers worldwide where you have rewilding. You look at a country like Peru, for example, they've been doing rewilding with the giant otter, with the puma, with the jaguar, with all these species where it's like we fucked up nature, we killed out some species, and now we're putting them back. That's basically what it is. But the discussion has just gone mental. It's a bit like, there's so many emotions in it now that to make sense of it, you just have to look at it where it started. It's a bit like discussing religion.
Yeah. No, there was. I was actually the reason why I'm also asking this is I was in a summer house area, and there was this guy who has a bakery in a summer house area, and there's obviously no bakeries there. Mm-hmm. He's really good at baking bread, so everyone goes there to buy bread. Perfect. It's a good strategy from a business perspective. True. And I'm standing in line because there's a line. You know, it's the only bakery in like 50 kilometers radius or something.
Yep. And
these two people come up with a poster for rewilding, and they want to put it on the door, and they're like, "Can we put it on the door?"
Are they for or against?
I couldn't tell, and that's what I told him, that just be aware that this is a topic that gets people very excited, and I don't think it's necessarily part of your bakery. And you know, and I couldn't tell him anything else than, you know, try and search on Facebook for rewilding, and you'll see that people are mortal enemies. And I can really figure out what the discussion is about, because I think the concept sounds appealing.
It's messed up. And also that stuff, it's about like, also the fencing. They're a bit like, they're not wild animals because if you fence them in, they're not wild. But we forget that if you look at many of the parks down in South Africa, where you have some of the biggest parks in the whole world, they're all fenced in. And it's one thing is to keep the animals in, another one is to keep people out. And if you take a country like Denmark, which is basically just a big field, and you want some areas where you have nature, you need to fence it in. Otherwise, you're going to have all the animals running out on people's fields because there's fucking fields everywhere. And that's going to upset the farmers. And the hunters are going to be like, but we want to shoot the animals. You're like, you can't fucking shoot them here, it's nature. And it's all confusing, and you have so many interests. And then you have some people who are very scientific, and you have some people who are very emotional. Mm-hmm. And you have some political parties that have just sort of declared war on this whole rewilding thing. And they're not being scientific. But as politicians, so people listen to them because they're umbrella species.
Yeah,
so
politicians are umbrella species.
I mean, if I am to, as a biologist, look at the whole rewilding thing, I'm definitely going to listen to the biology and the science. Mm-hmm. And I'm also going to be like, if we want some wild nature, and if we want some nature where we can have biodiversity, so we can sort of hold the biodiversity a bit, and we can contribute in Denmark, of course we need some areas that are dedicated to nature. And in those areas, we need the important species to uphold the ecosystem, key services, or do all that. So it's just, and we're going to have animals dying in those areas. We have one problem, that we can't have wolves in those parks that we're going to establish because they need territories too big, etc. So we're going to have to regulate the animals on our own, but that's just how it goes. And we're going to have to leave the dead animals. And that's going to look brutal, and people don't like that. Don't like seeing dead animals. We remove all of them in Denmark.
Unless it's in the supermarket where it's okay.
Yes, of course. And if we put pigs out in the national park, we could do what fucking ever we wanted with them.
Yeah.
But don't do, if you want to work with some animals, don't work with horses. And if we put out cats or something, we wouldn't, because it's not a native species, but people would go crazy too.
Are cats really not a native species?
Well, not in Denmark, I think. We have the European wildcat. It's some in Scotland, for example, they have that. Some places in Europe too, but I don't think it's native to Denmark. The lynx is.
Yeah. The lynx and the wolverine as well, or wolverine is from the Americas?
Wolverine is, no, it's the whole northern hemisphere. But I don't know if the wolverine was in Denmark. It's like the bear. I'm not sure.
We have a really good name for it in Danish. Yav.
Yeah.
Which is just a perfect word.
Sounds like what you say when you stump your toe on something.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
All right.
Good.
I think that just about concludes the Biodiversity 101. What is it? We can't really answer that strictly and uniformly. Why is it important? Well, it's because it's about all life on the planet and maintaining habitats and stability. That sounds urgent. Yeah. And what can we all do about it? It seems like moving away from animal produce is one of the biggest levers we can pull.
That's a good idea, yeah.
And what about that whole rewilding? Listen to science?
Yeah, I'm going to say that, and then, yeah, that's about it. And if we want to, it's sort of in the word, right? If we want it to be wild, we should rewild it. We're going to have to, and I mean, some things we can do and some things we can't.
Cool. Thanks a lot for being on the show, Alex.
Of course.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. Please remember to share, like, subscribe, rate wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have any feedback, any suggestions for how we might improve in this show, please tell us about it. Engage with us on LinkedIn. We really, really appreciate it whenever any of you share your thoughts or your comments about the show. So once again, thanks for listening, and thanks for taking part in decarbonizing the healthcare sector.